lock your doors, turn off the lights, and join us for stories of mythical horror. Before we begin, where are you listening from? Remember, there are creatures that don't need eyes to find you. This is ExMyth. The whole reason I was on that stretch of road in the first place was a history project that had gone sideways. I'm a structural engineer, not a historian, but my firm got the contract to assess the remaining piers of the old Silver Bridge tragedy near Point Pleasant, West Virginia. It's a somber piece of infrastructure history, a moment where everything went wrong, a structure collapsing under the weight of traffic in 1967. Locals still treat the area like a cemetery, and frankly, standing there on the riverbank, breathing in the damp, freezing air coming off the Ohio River, it felt like 1-2. The job was supposed to take a day. The fog and an unexpected ice storm stretched it to 3, and that's when the exhaustion really set in, making every shadow look like something else. I just wanted to get to the motel, but that's when the high beams hit a shape I couldn't process, making me stomp the brakes hard enough to jar my teeth. It happened just outside the city limits, maybe 2 miles past the last street lamp. The road, Route 35, was deserted and black as pitch. I was creeping along, fighting to keep my eyes open, when a movement off the shoulder grabbed my attention. I instinctively flicked the brights on. For a split second, I saw something tall, maybe 6 feet, maybe taller, standing where the guardrail met the woods. It didn't look like a deer, not with that silhouette, which was impossibly broad at the top, almost hunched. The thing didn't move like an animal. It moved like a person trying to decide if it wanted to cross, and a primal knot tightened in my stomach. I slowed to an absolute crawl, my truck's engine the loudest thing in the sudden, oppressive silence. I figured maybe it was a person, some poor bastard whose car had broken down, but as I inched closer, the details solidified into something far worse. It was a dense, charcoal black, darker than the shadows around it, and it had no discernible neck. It was just a torso and 2 incredibly long, stick-like legs. Then I saw the eyes. They weren't reflecting the light. They were generating it. 2 enormous, perfectly circular patches of an angry, terrifying red that stared right through my windshield and into my soul. The thing hadn't moved a muscle, but the sheer malevolence in those twin red orbs made my breath catch, filling the cab with the metallic tang of fear. I didn't stop. Couldn't. I floored the accelerator, not caring if the road was slick with ice, desperate to put distance between myself and that roadside horror. As I rocketed past the spot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, a rookie mistake. It wasn't there. The space where it had been standing was empty, and a wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. It was a trick of the light. It was exhaustion. It was a scarecrow someone had vandalized. I repeated the rationalizations until my hands stopped shaking on the steering wheel, but the silence inside the truck felt fragile, like a thin sheet of glass. The silence broke instantly when I heard a sound that didn't belong to the road, a sound like heavy, wet canvas ripping right over the roof of my truck. I swear, it felt like my tires left the asphalt for a second as I swerved, yelling a useless, panicked curse. The noise was immediately followed by a dull, weighty thump against the rear window, a sound that made the entire frame of the truck vibrate. I dared not look in the mirror again. I knew what I would see, or perhaps what I wouldn't. This was too big to be a bird, too quiet to be a plane. This was something with purpose, something that had been waiting, and now it was actively pursuing me with a terrifying, silent speed. Whatever was out there was keeping pace with my truck, and I could feel its unseen presence settling on me like a suffocating layer of ash. The next few minutes were a blur of adrenaline and white-knuckle driving. Every time I hit a slight curve, I could feel the truck shift, and each time, I imagined it was the creature leaning with the vehicle, its massive form clinging to the back like a grotesque backpack. I mashed the radio buttons, desperate for a human voice, any noise to break the pure, psychological isolation of the chase. But all I got was static and a high-pitched, metallic whine that vibrated deep in my ears. The whine suddenly intensified, a sound like grinding teeth mixed with a failing electrical grid. Right before my headlights cut out entirely. Total darkness. I was doing maybe 65 miles per hour on a twisting, icy road with zero visibility. My world shrank to the tiny, orange glow of the speedometer and the awful, sickening feeling of being hunted. I slammed my hand onto the high beam switch again and again. Nothing. That electrical whine must have been some kind of electromagnetic interference, powerful enough to fry my truck's entire lighting system, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the creature was responsible. I could feel its cold, triumphant gaze in the pitch black surrounding me. Then, a shadow, impossibly large and fast, passed directly in front of the moon's light, and I knew I was about to hit something that wasn't road. I hit the shoulder, skidding into a tangle of dead brush and mud, the truck finally coming to a violent stop that threw me forward against the seatbelt. Silence returned, deafening and complete. I was breathing in short, shallow gasps, waiting for the creature to smash through the windshield, for those red eyes to reappear inches from my face. I waited for 1 minute, then 2. Nothing. The only sound was the frantic pounding of my own heart. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen was dark, the battery seemingly dead. As I finally managed to push the door open and stumble into the cold air, the last thing I heard wasn't a growl or a shriek, but the faint, rhythmic swoosh of something impossibly large pulling itself up and away into the absolute blackness above the trees. I didn't look back. I started walking toward the distant, hazy light of Point Pleasant. When I finally reached the highway on-ramp, my truck was a mile back, silent, its electronics completely fried. The police report mentioned a broken antenna and a strange, unidentifiable oil-like residue staining the rear fender. They called it vandalism, but I know what I saw and I know why it was there. It wasn't guarding the bridge anymore. It was guarding the road, a silent, terrifying sentinel, waiting for the next tired, lone traveler to come driving by. I left Point Pleasant the next day and never went back. But every time I drive at night, I check the rearview mirror, just in case a shadow on the shoulder has eyes of angry, apocalyptic red. I fix roads for a living, which means I spend more time than most alone on the shoulder of highways, counting cracks and measuring guardrail damage in places sane people only visit when their luck runs out. It was a Tuesday, quiet, dry, and boring, until the rain rolled in like a slow bruise and the fog stitched itself across Route 35 near the river flats. I kept telling myself the visibility would improve, but soon my high beams were just carving a white wall that swallowed everything beyond 30 feet. I should have turned back. That thought felt sensible and small right up until I saw the eyes. They were not headlights and they were not tail reflectors. 2 red points hovering over the ditch, too high to be a raccoon, too steady to be a deer. I eased my truck to the shoulder, engine idling, wipers clicking a metronome, the radio muttering nothing but static between stations. The smell of wet leaves and creosote from the guardrail wrapped around me as I opened the door and stepped out, measuring wheel in one hand, flashlight in the other. Those eyes didn't move, but they didn't blink like anything alive should. That's when my skepticism cracked. "Hey," I called, because that's what you do when you need reality to answer back, even if you're talking to a ditch. My beam found cattails, mud, a sagging fence, the shimmer of rain on asphalt, and then the light faltered when it crossed those eyes, like the world behind them refused illumination. I took 3 steps forward, my boots sinking, the flashlight struggling, the radio hiss growing louder like a breath in my ear. The red points lifted, slow and deliberate, higher than any person could reach without a ladder. I realized there was something standing in front of me, and it was tall enough to make the guardrail look child-sized. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog, a reflection off a traffic sign, a prank with a drone, anything but wings. The outline was wrong in every direction. Shoulders too wide, torso too narrow, a silhouette that seemed more absence than shape. Then it shifted, and a paler darkness unfurled from either side of the thing, wide as the hood of a truck, the edges whispering against the rain as if feathered but too stiff to be bird. I took a step back, but the measuring wheel clattered against the rail, a small stupid sound in a world that felt newly enormous. The red eyes tilted, studying me like a driver studies a pothole. "Not today," I said, trying to sound like a foreman, like a man whose job was to fix things that were broken on the ground. The body didn't move, but the air changed, denser, colder, the kind that makes you aware of your teeth. The radio cut to silence, and in that void a low tone swelled, not in my ears but behind them, like pressure at altitude that had chosen me for practice. I took another step back and the ditch water drew a perfect circle of ripples, like a lid settling on a jar. Somewhere behind me, a truck swept past, a blur of headlights that should have been comforting, but when it cleared, the road was empty and the eyes were closer. I aimed my flashlight again and found edges that weren't edges, feathers that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. My hands shook. The measuring wheel bumped my shin, reminding me I was here on state business, and for a heartbeat that felt brave. I raised the radio. County 12, I said. I've got a hazard at mile marker 14 possible. Static bit down on my words, and then, beneath it, a single voice whispered something that would have been my name if my name ever belonged to air. The rain intensified, blowing sideways, as if the weather wanted to push me into the ditch to join whatever watched me from it. I didn't want to believe in wings. What finally made me move wasn't the eyes or the wings. It was the smell. Not decay, not animal musk, but the scent of a hot transformer after a storm, metallic and overheated, humming through the rain. I heard a faint crackle, and the low tone rose, the pressure threading down my spine. The thing leaned forward, weightless and heavy at the same time, and the guardrail vibrated like a tuning fork. I stepped back, right foot, left foot, deliberate like avoiding a spill, until my shoulder found the truck door. The eyes followed, slow and patient, as if they'd never chased anything in their life because nothing ever needed to run. I climbed in and locked the doors like locks meant anything against something that didn't belong to doors. The windshield fogged, the wipers smeared rain, and for a moment the red eyes were just two bleeding circles in a gray soup. I started the truck into a three-point turn and felt the tires skid on the muddy shoulder, gravel popping, the engine whining. When I looked up again, the eyes had lifted above the hood. No, they had risen, and the shape behind them had spread out, a shadow taken to its full height. The low tone was in the cab now, and my fillings hurt like they were trying to dislodge. I pressed the gas. The tires caught, and the truck lunged onto the road. I expected to see taillights, a line of normal life, but the highway was an evacuated theater. No cars, no distant glow, just the mirrored black of wet asphalt and the periodic flash of markers disappearing into fog. In my rear view, the red eyes didn't get smaller. They gained angle. The shadow floated over the shoulder, keeping pace with me at 30, then 40, as if speed was a decision it granted me out of politeness. I told myself it was a barn owl caught in light, something explainable, and then it skimmed across the lane like a prayer missing the point. That's when I realized it didn't flap. I cracked the window for air I didn't need and got another smell. Wet copper, hot wire, and the damp paper of old books left in a basement. The radio popped alive long enough to spit a station ID from somewhere I'd never heard of, then died again. The tone threaded through the truck's frame, making the dash vibrate, turning my steering wheel into an instrument I hadn't learned to play. I checked the mile marker, 13.5, and swore at myself for doing it. The eyes lifted above the cab, and for a moment they were reflected in the windshield, doubly wrong like bad math. I hit 50. The shoulder narrowed ahead where Route 35 clung to the river's curve, guardrail old enough to creak under light wind. That's when a memory arrives whether you welcome it or not. The bridge that fell in '67 when cables snapped like fiddle strings and the river made a second mouth. Silver Bridge. The words are born of fact, the kind of fact that lives in safety briefings and old men's weather stories, and suddenly you tell yourself you are not the first along this road to catch a shadow out of place. I did not want the story in my cab. I wanted the road to be just road. And then the guardrail sang. The sound was unmistakable. A metal keening, not from impact but resonance, as if something tall and patient was plucking it with fingers that knew pitch. I eased to the center of the lane, afraid of the edge like it had just become temptation. The shadow kept pace with me on the right, never quite touching the rail but close enough to make it sound. The red eyes hung just above my hood line, tilted with a curiosity that felt older than my job, older than the road. The rain sheeted, the fog thickened, and for a second the world disappeared except for those eyes and the dash vibrating like it would shake itself free. That's when the headlights found something ahead. A car sat sideways across both lanes. A white sedan, hazard lights blinking soft orange in the gray, nose tucked halfway into the ditch like it was trying to hide from consequences. I braked too hard, ABS juddering, the seatbelt grabbing my chest. The shadow rose higher and higher, pulling away just enough to give me angle. I swerved left and slid in a controlled panic, the measuring wheel clattering somewhere behind the seat like loose bones. The sedan's driver's door opened, and a figure stumbled out, waving both arms, eyes glazed with wet. I pulled up short, blocking traffic that didn't exist. The red eyes drifted backward, giving us space like interest that wasn't appetite. That's when the driver started shouting. He was older than me, maybe 60, wearing a construction jacket, and he was crying in that way men cry when something has explained itself without language. "It stopped," he yelled, pointing at the sedan, voice torn up by the rain. "It just stopped dead. Power. All of it." He looked at me, at the truck, at the world, then at whatever stood in the fog behind us. "You see it?" he said, like if I admitted it, physics would take responsibility. I nodded because my throat wouldn't risk the truth and because it felt like lying would anger something that didn't belong to our ecosystem. Then the hazard lights on his car glitched, blinking too fast like a heart that had lost the beat. The tone in my truck deepened. "I'm going to pull you out," I said, idiot brave, and backed the truck until the hitch lined up with his front tow hook. I killed the engine to wire the strap, and the silence was enormous. I could hear rain hitting my jacket, breath moving in my mask. The soft click of hazard lights sped into panic. Behind it all, the low tone rumbled in the bones of the road, and the guardrail sang a note that matched it with a harmony no human ear should recognize. The red eyes shifted, just enough to acknowledge we were busy. I hooked the strap and signaled the driver to get clear. That's when the fog changed color. A faint brownish stain rolled through it, as if sodium lights had been born without lamps, and the shadow stepped into that sepia like a photograph learning to breathe. I didn't see legs so much as I saw an absence where legs should be, a darkness that suggested weight through what it refused to reveal. The wings flexed once. Not a flap, but a slow tautness that adjusted the air. The truck's frame creaked. I turned the engine, and for 3 beats nothing happened, as if it had decided it worked for someone else now. On the 4th, the starter caught, angry and loud. The tones surged in agreement, and the hazard lights went steady. That's when the red eyes looked past me. They weren't hunting. They weren't pleading. They were acknowledging, and I felt it like a cold hand at the base of my skull. In the fog behind the sedan, somewhere near mile marker 14, I saw what looked like the suggestion of a shape. A second shadow that should have been a sapling or a signpost but carried the intent of a presence. The guardrail fell silent. The tone eased, and for a heartbeat I thought it was over. Then, very softly, the sedan's radio came alive and said a word in a language I didn't know with my ears but understood as evacuation. The driver started praying in Spanish, words ragged like gauze. The red eyes closed, not a blink, but a curtain drawn to change the scene. That's when I hit the gas. The strap pulled tight, the sedan bumped out of the ditch, and I waved the driver to put it in neutral. He scrambled to his passenger side and climbed in, eyes wide, mouth in open argument with weather. I towed him nothing to the next exit, watching those eyes in the rear view, the shadow pacing the shoulder with a politeness that felt like a boundary it had set for us. The tone softened but did not leave, threaded through the engine noise like a murmur from under the floorboards of a church. The fog thinned to a smear. The sodium stain faded. The world regained edges in clumsy increments. That's when the eyes stopped following. They didn't disappear. They stopped, between the last 2 reflectors before the exit ramp. The red points paused, hovering just above the rail, and the shadow folded its knot wings into narrower absence. I slowed, half ready to believe it wanted toll, half ready to believe it wanted nothing but to remind me the transaction was already complete. The driver climbed out at the gas station, shaking, hugging me with wet arms and calling me hermano, because different roads make family from fear. We stood under the fluorescent canopy, looking back at where the highway curved into fog. The red eyes were gone, but the tone was not. It had sunk under everything like groundwater. That's when the station lights flickered. If this is where you expect a lesson, I don't have one. I filed the incident report with the vague poetry bureaucracies prefer, weather, visibility, obstruction, and wrote the rest in a notebook I keep for what work teaches us that work can't hold. I drove that stretch of Route 35 3 more times that week, in daylight and in dusk, and listened for the guardrail song and sniffed for the transformer heat and watched the ditch for eyes that never deserved the word. None of it repeated, which somehow feels worse than if it had. I don't think it hunts. I think it audits. And if you ask me what failed on that sedan, I will tell you I don't know, because I don't. That's when you'll notice I avoid bridges now. I was driving home from a late shift, the kind where the clock feels like it's chewing on your nerves, when my car started to rattle near the old suspension bridge outside Point Pleasant. Midnight had just passed, and the road was empty except for the hum of tires and the occasional splash of water against the pilings below. I slowed down, thinking maybe the alignment was off, but the sound wasn't coming from the car. It was coming from the bridge itself. The steel cables were vibrating, low and steady, like someone plucking a bass string. I rolled down the window, expecting wind, but the air was dead still. That's when I noticed the shape perched on the far end of the span, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. 2 red eyes glowed like coals, fixed on me, unblinking. My first thought was a prank, some kid with a flashlight, but the eyes were too high, too steady, and too wrong. I pressed the gas, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the hum deepened, rattling through the steering wheel. The shape shifted, wings unfurling with a slow, deliberate stretch that made the cables shiver harder. I gripped the wheel tighter, heart pounding, because whatever it wasn't waiting for me to pass. It was waiting for me to notice. Halfway across, the headlights flickered. The dashboard went dark. My car was still moving, but powerless, coasting on momentum. I could hear my own breath, sharp and shallow, and the hum rising like a warning. The red eyes tilted, following me, and for a moment I thought the bridge itself was alive, groaning under the weight of something it couldn't bear. I remembered the Silver Bridge collapse in 1967, the way people said strange sightings came before it fell. That thought hit me like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I wasn't just crossing a bridge. I was crossing into a story that had already been written once before. The car slowed, rolling toward the far side. I gripped the wheel, whispering to myself, "Don't stop, don't stop." The eyes lifted, wings spreading wider, and the hum reached a pitch that made my teeth ache. Then, just as the car reached solid ground, the lights snapped back on, the engine roared alive, and the cables fell silent. I didn't look back, couldn't, but in the rearview mirror, for a split second, I saw those red eyes hovering above the bridge, watching, waiting, as if reminding me that some structures don't fail by accident. My name is Sarah, and before this happened, I considered myself a grounded, pragmatic person. I work as an overnight courier for a specialized medical service, meaning I spend a lot of time on empty back roads between midnight and dawn. This particular route was along the Ohio River Scenic Byway, a beautiful drive during the day, but a winding, isolated tunnel of trees at night. It was 3 a.m., the kind of hour where your own thoughts start to feel like company. I was on the stretch that overlooks the deepest part of the gorge, a place where, even on a clear night, the radio struggles to hold a signal, and the fog always seems thicker than everywhere else. I was sipping lukewarm coffee, trying to ignore the absolute silence of the cab, when a flash of movement high up on the ridge line caught the edge of my vision, making me instinctively brake. It wasn't a headlight, and it wasn't a reflection. It was a dense, monolithic shape, perched impossibly high on a jagged outcrop maybe 200 feet above the road. The fog had begun to roll in thick, giving the area a ghostly, indistinct quality, but whatever that thing was, it cut a profile against the sparse moonlight that was utterly alien. It was a massive V-shape, a structure that looked like an anatomical diagram of a giant, inverted heart, and it was watching the road. Specifically, it was watching me. The sheer size of the thing made my blood run cold, but the realization that it was absolutely motionless, just perched there, introduced a far deeper, more unsettling dread. I pulled my van over to the shoulder, not out of curiosity, but out of a paralyzing disbelief. I took out my heavy-duty work binoculars, the kind that can make a distant signpost look crystal clear. I raised them slowly, my hands already slick with sweat, and focused on the outcrop. The resolution snapped the creature into terrifying focus. It wasn't a structure. It was organic, covered in short, dark, rough fur, and it had colossal, folded wings that looked like they could generate enough force to peel the paint off my van. But the truly sickening detail wasn't the wings. It was the face, or rather, the horrifying lack of one, replaced by two enormous, glowing red eyes that bore down on me like twin searchlights. I didn't scream. I didn't move. All the air was sucked out of the vehicle. Those eyes weren't reflective. They were radiating a hot, unnerving light, and they were fixated. It felt personal, like I had interrupted a powerful, ancient guardian on its watch. The thought that such a creature could exist, that it wasn't some campfire tale but a real, massive being capable of flight and observing humanity from above, shattered my reality in a single, painful moment. The silence broke when the creature moved, not by flapping its wings, but by simply unfolding them. A slow, deliberate motion that sounded like an enormous sheet of wet sailcloth being unfurled in a stiff breeze. The sound was shockingly loud, echoing down the gorge. The wingspan must have been at least 10 feet, maybe more, and as they fully extended, they completely blocked out the moon, plunging the road and my van into an absolute, suffocating darkness. That was my cue. I slammed the binoculars down, threw the van into drive, and floored it. I didn't care about the icy patches or the curves. I just needed to be out from under that thing's oppressive shadow. I was doing 75, adrenaline pumping pure ice through my veins, when a sudden, sickening sound of ripping metal directly behind me made me look into the side mirror. The creature was gone from the outcrop, but my mirror showed a blur of black and red, right behind the rear doors of the van, keeping pace effortlessly. It wasn't flying above me now. It was using the air current off the van, gliding just inches away. I could hear the faint, high-pitched scream of its claws periodically scratching against the metal bumper. It felt less like a chase and more like it was simply escorting me, playing with its food before the final act. I tried to swerve to shake it off, but the thing was too fast, too efficient, and its presence was now pressing against the vehicle, making the steering feel heavy and unresponsive. In a moment of sheer desperation, I remembered a story a retired park ranger once told me about animals and loud, sudden noises. I reached for the air horn, a massive, obnoxious rig-style horn I had installed years ago, and held the button down. The deafening blast ripped through the night air, echoing off the gorge walls and momentarily shocking my own ears. The sound worked. The scratching stopped instantly, and the massive shadow peeled away from the van. But the relief lasted only a second before I saw what it did next. Instead of retreating into the trees, it gained altitude in a single, powerful upstroke, rising maybe 50 feet above the road. It didn't make a sound, but as it crossed the river, the creature seemed to dive bomb an overhead power line that spanned the gorge. There was a brilliant, blinding flash of blue-white light, a massive electrical arc, and then the entire gorge was plunged into total darkness. My headlights flickered violently before dying for good, and the radio, which had just crackled back to life, went dead with a pathetic pop. I was driving blind into the deepest part of the gorge, and the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the brief, terrifying image of those two angry red eyes descending toward my windshield. I instinctively veered right, slamming on the brakes. The van slid, hit the muddy shoulder, and rolled to a stop, its front bumper buried in the embankment. I sat there, shaking, the smell of burnt ozone mixing with the damp earth. I waited, listening only to the labored ticking of the cooling engine. I waited for 10 minutes. The creature was gone. When the emergency services found me hours later, they blamed the power outage on a transformer failure and my crash on driver fatigue. But they couldn't explain the 3 deep, parallel gouges, too high to be a deer, too low to be a falling branch, that scored the roof of my courier van, leading right up to the back window. That night, I learned that sometimes the things that watch us from the deepest shadows aren't monsters of myth, but guardians of tragedy, waiting for the perfect moment to remind us just how vulnerable we are. My shift had just ended at the coal plant outside Charleston. It was 4:30 a.m., cold enough that my breath fogged in the cab of my old pickup, and I was looking forward to nothing more than my bed. My commute home takes me across a particularly notorious stretch of I-77 where it crosses the Kanawha River near an abandoned industrial park. It's a section famous for thick, sudden river fog and terrible visibility, and this night was no exception. The fog was so dense that my high beams barely pierced a few yards ahead, forcing me to creep along in the slow lane, feeling my way through the gloom. I was tense enough just worrying about hydroplaning, but the deep, unnatural reverberation I felt through the steering wheel introduced a fear that had nothing to do with the weather. It wasn't a pothole or a bad tire. It was a rhythmic, almost subsonic thrum, traveling through the suspension and up through my seat. It sounded and felt exactly like something immensely heavy was hitting the road surface directly beneath me, a beat or two behind the cab. I checked my rearview mirror, just a wall of white fog. I checked the dash, everything fine. But the sound persisted, thrum, thrum, thrum. It was impossibly consistent, and whatever was causing it, it was matching my speed precisely, creating a jarring internal echo in the truck. The thought that someone was tailgating me in this dense fog was terrifying enough, but the pattern of the thrumming suggested a stride too large and too powerful for a human. I sped up slightly, pushing the truck from 45 to 55 miles per hour. The thrumming sped up immediately to match, never missing a beat. I slowed down to 30 miles per hour. The thrumming slowed with me, maintaining that perfect, agonizing proximity. It was like I had a giant metronome glued to my bumper, except this metronome weighed several hundred pounds and was moving on its own 2 feet. The realization that this was an encounter, not an accident, made the fine hairs on my arms stand straight up despite the cold. I reached the overpass, a section of elevated highway that felt particularly exposed, when the thrumming abruptly stopped, replaced by a much more visceral, disturbing sound. Now, the sound was directly above me. A quick, wet slap, slap, slap against the concrete deck above the highway. It was clear and sharp, and it sounded like something with huge, grasping talons was scrambling across the concrete, right over my roof. I slammed my fist against the horn, a useless, pathetic gesture of defiance. I was completely exposed, trapped in a metal box beneath this unseen thing. I started yelling, screaming for it to get away. My own desperate noise swallowed instantly by the relentless echo of its movement directly overhead. The creature seemed to be racing me along the overpass, its movements erratic and fast, no longer rhythmic. Then, the most horrific thing happened. As I passed the central support pylon, a shadow detached itself from the underside of the overpass, descending rapidly toward my truck. It wasn't a fall. It was a deliberate, controlled drop, and I saw a flash of those familiar, terrible red eyes less than 3 feet above my windshield. The creature didn't shriek or growl. It simply filled my world for a half second. A massive, black-furred silhouette with those burning, judging eyes, before striking the concrete divider wall next to me with a devastating, wet crunch. The impact was seismic. My truck shuddered violently from the shockwave, and the passenger side windows exploded inward into a million fragments of safety glass. I swerved hard, terrified, but whatever hit the wall didn't stay there. I saw its dark shape immediately rise back up, the red eyes briefly visible as it effortlessly scaled the concrete barrier and disappeared over the side of the overpass, back into the abyss of the fog-shrouded river below. I kept driving, the wind rushing through the shattered window, until I reached a well-lit gas station. But the encounter wasn't quite over. I pulled into the lot, shaking and bleeding from the neck where a tiny shard of glass had hit me. I called the police. I told them I hit a large deer, knowing they'd never believe the truth. While waiting, I got out to inspect the damage. The truck was fine, save for the shattered windows. But as I walked around to the passenger side, I found a single, horrifying artifact lodged deep in the rubber seal of the rear window. A massive, gray-black claw, maybe 6 inches long, wickedly curved, and still dripping a viscous, oily fluid. I put it in a napkin, intending to show it to someone, anyone. But when the state trooper arrived, I panicked, knowing I couldn't risk sounding insane. I threw the napkin into a trash barrel. They looked at the glass, gave me a citation for debris on the highway, and left. I drove home, threw the coal dust out of my truck, and tried to forget. I still use that highway, but now I drive the entire overpass section with my eyes glued to the ceiling of the concrete above, waiting for the return of that silent, heavy thrum that promises a descent from the sky. I was driving a rental car, a sleek, forgettable sedan, heading back to Columbus after visiting family in Gallipolis, Ohio. It was late December, and the wind had a brutal, biting edge. Route 62 near the Ohio-West Virginia border is a lonely ribbon of asphalt, especially around 1 a.m. I had my phone charging and the radio playing some classic rock, trying to ignore the way the passing woods looked like they were leaning in over the road. I consider myself pretty alert, but that night, I felt an almost immediate, heavy sense of unease that settled in my chest the moment I crossed the final county line. The radio suddenly dissolved into harsh, electronic static, a sound so abrasive it felt like someone had shoved needles into my ears, forcing me to slap the power button. The silence that followed was terrifying. It wasn't just the absence of music. It was a profound, unnatural stillness, as if the entire night, the crickets, the wind, even the sound of my own engine had been muted. I fiddled with the knobs, trying to tune back in, when I noticed something deeply wrong with the electrical systems of the car. The dash lights were flickering erratically, and the digital clock was cycling through random numbers at high speed. It was a complete electronic failure, right in the middle of nowhere. I instinctively glanced up at the nearest street lamp, and the sight of its sudden, explosive death made me realize this wasn't an electrical short. It was a devastating force. The lamp, maybe 50 yards ahead, didn't just burn out. It popped with a sharp, crackling sound, and the glass housing seemed to shatter from the internal pressure of the surge. As I approached the now darkened pole, I saw the cause. Perched on top of the shattered fixture, hunched and immense, was a figure that defied biology and logic. It was charcoal black, massive, and its structure was dominated by two enormous, folded membranes that looked like they were absorbing the last remnants of light from the environment. I didn't need to see its face to know what it was. The sheer size and the feeling of crushing power it radiated immediately confirmed every terrifying folklore story I dismissed. I pushed the gas pedal down, desperate to clear the area, but the car was sluggish, its engine sputtering as if struggling to fight through invisible drag. As I passed beneath the creature, I looked up through the sunroof. Another mistake. I saw a dense, furry underbelly and two colossal, segmented feet gripping the metal fixture. But just before I passed clear, a strange, wet sound, like heavy leather gloves slowly separating, came directly from above, and then a thick, sticky, clear liquid rained down onto the glass. The liquid was heavy and viscous, and as it hit the roof of the rental car, it made a thick, sickening sound that immediately started to smell like burnt plastic and something deeply organic, metallic. I accelerated violently, the car finally lurching forward, and I watched in the side mirror as the creature launched itself from the pole, not by flapping, but by simply extending its huge wings and catching the air. It rose like a grotesque balloon, silent and terrifying, and then began to circle, gaining altitude with impossible speed. I realized it wasn't chasing me on the ground. It was tracking me from the air, like a buzzard circling something already dead. I gripped the wheel, sweat freezing on my temples, when the interior of the car was suddenly bathed in a pulsing, blinding red light that wasn't coming from behind, but from directly above. The creature had positioned itself high over the road, using the sparse moonlight to illuminate its form, and those twin, massive eyes were glaring down at me with surgical focus. The pulsing red light was oppressive and paralyzing. It was moving too fast for me to see the individual wing beats, but I could hear a sound now, a high-pitched, almost ultrasonic shriek that vibrated the very metal of the car, causing a dull, throbbing pain behind my eyes. I knew it was preparing for something, maybe a dive, maybe a full electromagnetic burst, and I had to break its sightline immediately or I was dead. I saw an abandoned, overgrown dirt pull-off leading to an old logging trail about 200 yards ahead. Without thinking, I wrenched the wheel hard right and slammed on the brake, sending the car sliding sideways and into the brush. I drove the sedan 10 feet down the trail and then killed the engine and lights, plunging the car into absolute, disorienting blackness. I threw myself onto the passenger floor, breathing hard, hoping the tree canopy and the darkness would hide me. After maybe a minute of agonizing silence, I heard the single most disturbing sound of the entire night. A deep, hollow whoosh followed by the impact of something huge landing directly on the roof of the car, denting the metal above my head with a sickening, grinding noise. It was right there. I could feel the car trembling under its weight. I lay curled up, listening to the heavy, rasping breaths coming from just inches above me. The smell of that metallic, burnt plastic substance was overpowering. I don't know how long I stayed there, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. But then, as abruptly as it arrived, the weight lifted, the smell began to dissipate, and the silence returned. This time, a genuine silence of absence. I waited another half hour before driving the ruined rental back to the main road. The massive dent on the roof a constant, terrifying reminder. The rental company charged me for a bird strike, but I know what I met that night on Route 62. It wasn't just a cryptid. It was a predator that hunted the weak signals of human fear and electrical current. I was an independent researcher, a hobbyist historian specializing in Cold War relics. My current fixation was locating and documenting abandoned civil defense installations across Ohio. That night, I was deep in the woods near Chillicothe, specifically tracking a rumored emergency broadcast relay station built near a decommissioned military testing range. My vehicle was an older Jeep Cherokee, rugged enough for the trails, but completely unremarkable otherwise. The date was October 18th, a detail that, given the creature's alleged connections to historical disasters, chills me even now, thinking about its possible significance. I was miles down a deeply rutted, abandoned service road, relying solely on my GPS and the faint, unsettling smell of decaying autumn leaves and ozone, when my vehicle suddenly died. It wasn't a gentle failure. The engine coughed once, hard, and then everything went dark. No lights, no radio, nothing. The Jeep was just a shell of cold metal and plastic now. I tried the key again and again, but the ignition was utterly unresponsive. The woods here were ancient, dense, and quiet, and the sudden cessation of all mechanical noise left a void that felt physically oppressive. I grabbed my powerful military flashlight and stepped out into the freezing night. I opened the hood, expecting a loose battery terminal or a fried fuse, but the sheer chaos beneath the bonnet suggested an energy release far beyond a simple vehicle malfunction. The battery casing was cracked, oozing a nasty, dark fluid, and there was a widespread, acrid smell of burnt plastic and copper. It was an impossible amount of damage for a single engine failure. I stood there, shining my light into the gloom, feeling increasingly exposed, realizing whatever caused this wasn't electrical. It was something external, powerful, and deliberate. And then I heard the sound that confirmed I was no longer alone. The sound was a quick succession of loud, high-pitched clicks, almost like a massive insect's mandibles rapidly closing, and it seemed to be coming from the ridge line high above me. I swung my flashlight up, blinding myself momentarily on the low-hanging branches before finally settling the beam on the summit. I didn't see the creature immediately, but I saw the effect of its presence. High above, nestled against the dark clouds, were 2 points of perfect, intense, brilliant red light, hovering perhaps 50 feet above the trees. They were massive and circular, and they didn't blink or shift. They simply stared. The eyes were mesmerizing and terrifying, and as I watched, they began to slowly descend, moving not with a float or a glide, but with a palpable, downward pressure that seemed to bend the air. I dropped the hood and ran back to the relative safety of the Jeep, but the creature was too fast. Before I could even reach the door handle, the entire area was flooded with a blinding, deep crimson light that wasn't just illumination. It felt like a physical pressure, like staring into the core of a dying star. The clicking noise intensified, becoming a rapid, sickening rattle. This wasn't just an observation. This was an active, aggressive display of energy, and I knew I was the target. I turned and ran blindly down the service road, away from the Jeep and the blinding red eyes, convinced the creature was about to land and tear the vehicle apart. I didn't slow down until I tripped over something low and metallic, the rusted grate cover of a ventilation shaft. I recognized it instantly from my research. This was the air intake for the old military bunker, a deep, concrete survival shelter built straight into the hillside. Desperate, I fumbled with the hatch release handle and managed to yank the heavy metal door open, revealing a black, damp hole descending into the earth. I scrambled down the cold, earthen steps, the intense crimson glow and the sickening clicking sounds fading rapidly as the thick concrete sealed me off from the horror outside. I sat in the cold, silent darkness of the old shelter, shaking violently, waiting for the heavy concrete door to be ripped open. I waited for hours, listening to the drip of condensation and the frantic pounding of my own heart. But nothing happened. The silence outside was absolute. When I finally convinced myself to climb back out just before dawn, the world looked normal, draped in the cool gray light of morning. But as I walked back toward my Jeep, I saw that the creature hadn't just left. It had delivered a horrifying, personal message. My vehicle was completely untouched, not a scratch on the paint. But every single tire, all four, plus the spare mounted on the back, was flat. Not punctured, but perfectly, cleanly ripped. The rubber neatly peeled back from the rims in long, impossibly uniform strips, like skin peeled from an orange. Whatever that thing was, it could immobilize a car without touching the main body, and it knew exactly where I was, waiting patiently for me to emerge from the hole in the ground. The creature hadn't attacked me in the shelter, but by leaving the car ruined, it ensured my fear of that desolate road would be absolute and permanent.